Usually, when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of, you know, mechanical precision. Like you shatter your arm, you get an X-ray, and there's this high contrast image of a jagged white line.
Right, the surgeon just points right to it and says, yep, there's the problem. It's a visible physical breakdown.
Exactly. But the second we pivot from bones to, well, the architecture of human behavior, specifically habits and neurodevelopment, that X-ray machine is entirely useless.
Oh, completely. The diagnostic landscape is just incredibly opaque.
Right, because we all walk around with this profound, unquestioned assumption that we are the conscious authors of our lives.
Yeah.
But the text we're diving into today introduces this neurological reality that is, frankly, super unsettling.
It really is. I mean, we're talking about upwards of 40% of the actions you execute every single day not being conscious decisions at all. They're literally just automated scripts.
40%. That sheer volume of automation is just wild.
Yeah, nearly half of your waking hours are governed by hardware that operates completely below the threshold of your conscious awareness.
Which is exactly why we're treating this as a Cortex Lab masterclass, deep dive into the absolute bleeding edge of habit formation. We are skipping the intro stuff today.
Right, no hand-holding. We're assuming you listening to this right now already know the basic cue routine reward loop.
Yeah, we are not spending time on pop psychology platitudes. The mission here is to tear down the advanced frameworks, the deep neurology, and honestly, the massive ethical minefields around behavioral engineering.
And most importantly, we're going to map out the exact grueling 90-day blueprint for permanent identity reconstruction, because that's what 100 out of 100 mastery actually requires.
Absolutely. And the source stack we're synthesizing today is massive. We've got MIT electroencephalogram data, case studies on medial temporal lobe lesions, and predictive analytics from retail giants like Target.
We're also looking closely at third-party data brokers. The text details a firm called Rapeleaf, looking at how they scrape and buy data on consumer behaviors, media consumption, and even political leanings.
And just to pause on that, we have to establish our parameters super clearly right up front. We are maintaining strict neutrality regarding all that data.
Yes, entirely neutral. We are not taking any sides or endorsing any political viewpoints whatsoever.
Right. Nor are we making moral judgments on the existence of these firms. We are literally just reporting on the factual, algorithmic capabilities of data brokers exactly as the sources describe them.
Because, frankly, you cannot understand modern habit formation without understanding how your data is being weaponized out there.
Exactly. So let's get into it. Before we can master our behavior, we have to look at the exact biological machinery that takes a conscious choice and turns it into an unthinking reflex.
Yeah, so bypassing the usual anatomical metaphors, the sources point us straight to the basal ganglia. It's this primitive, golf ball-sized cluster of cells right near the brainstem.
But what's fascinating isn't where it is, it's what it does. The MIT rat studies prove this thing is the absolute engine of what they call chunking.
Right, chunking. The researchers surgically implanted these microscopic sensors into the basal ganglia of rats to monitor the exact frequency of their brain cells firing.
And the setup was pretty simple, right? Just a T-shaped maze.
Yeah, simple T-maze with a partition. There's a piece of chocolate at the far end. A loud click sounds, the partition drops, and the rat explores.
And those initial brain scans are just, it's a portrait of absolute cognitive chaos.
Oh, completely. The data from those first runs showed massive sustained spikes across the entire cerebral cortex. The brain is just burning an immense amount of glucose.
Because the rat is processing all this novel sensory input, right? It's sniffing the walls, scratching the floor, trying to decode the environment.
Exactly. The prefrontal cortex is working overtime. But then they force the rat to run that exact same maze hundreds of times. And the data shows a fundamental shift.
It's not just that the rat gets faster. The brain actually changes where it routes the electricity.
Yes. As the navigation becomes rote, the activity in the higher-level processing centers basically flatlines. The rat stops sniffing and just zips to the chocolate.
But the crazy part is what happens inside the basal ganglia. After a week, that sustained hum of activity is gone.
Right. The graph just shows two hyper-concentrated spikes. One precise spike the millisecond the click sounds, and a second spike the millisecond it gets the chocolate.
The brain literally goes to sleep during the routine itself. The click is the trigger, the chocolate is the termination code, and the basal ganglia just handles the actual running.
It's like writing a macro for a complex spreadsheet.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It's like initially backing a car out of the driveway takes massive prefrontal focus. You're checking mirrors, calculating distance, riding the brake.
But eventually, the basal ganglia takes over that entire ballet. It compiles the raw code into an executable file, freeing up your CPU to, think about a forgotten lunchbox.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more. What is the specific biological difference between making a conscious choice and just running an automated loop?
That is where the case study of Eugene Pauly, or EP, comes in. It's tragic but fascinating. Viral encephalitis essentially dissolved his medial temporal lobe.
Which completely obliterated his conscious declarative memory, right?
Totally. His doctors could leave the room for 3 minutes, come back, and he'd greet them as strangers. If you asked him to draw a map of his own house, he couldn't do it.
He had zero spatial memory of his leaving situation.
None. But if he felt hungry, he would stand up, walk right down the hall, turn at the correct doorway, open a specific cabinet, and grab a jar of nuts.
Wait, so he couldn't tell you where the kitchen was, but he could walk perfectly to it.
Exactly. And it proves that habits form entirely outside of conscious memory. His medial temporal lobe was gone, but his basal ganglia was perfectly intact.
There's that crazy story in the text where his wife realizes he wandered out the front door, and she's terrified because the doctor said if he leaves the property, he's permanently lost.
Right, because he doesn't know his own address. But she finds him just sitting in the living room watching the History Channel. He had completed his entire daily walk around the neighborhood.
Without any conscious memory of the route. The physical sensation of the sidewalk, the visual cue of a tree, those external cues triggered the automated navigational macro.
The procedural memory in the basal ganglia operates completely independently. It just waits in the dark for a recognized cue, and then it forcibly takes over the motor functions.
Which brings us to what 99% of experts get completely wrong. If this thing is just waiting for a cue, what makes the script so impossible to override? What's the fuel?
This is when we get into Wolfram Schultz's research with primates.
Yeah.
He was mapping dopamine receptors to see how addiction and cravings actually work.
Right, the monkey and the blackberry juice.
Yeah. Initially, when the monkey learns that a light means it gets juice, the brain registers a massive dopamine spike the exact moment the juice hits its tongue. The reward is the finish line.
But then the habit gets ingrained, and the timing shifts.
Exactly. The dopamine spike travels backward in time. The brain stops spiking when it gets the juice and starts spiking the exact millisecond the light turns on.
The anticipation becomes the actual reward.
That is wild.
And here's the dangerous part. Once that anticipation is locked in, if the monkey sees the light, gets the dopamine spike of anticipation, but you withhold the juice,
The brain registers a massive plunge in neurological activity. It's actual biological pain.
that is the structural definition of a craving. A habit is only automatic when the basal ganglia starts anticipating the reward before the routine even begins.
So it's not just that your brain likes the reward. It will actively punish you with chemical withdrawal if you don't execute the routine.
It completely reframes addiction from a moral failing to a mechanical hijacking.
And nobody illustrates that hijacking better than Reza Habib's 2010 MRI study on slot machines and near misses.
Oh, the near-miss data is terrifying. He put social gamblers and pathological gambling addicts into MRI machines and showed them a slot machine simulation. Right, showing them clear wins, clear losses, and near misses, where two symbols line up and the third is just barely off the line.
Now, objectively, a near miss is a total loss. You win $0. And the social gamblers' brains processed it that way. Their reward centers stayed dormant.
But for the pathological gamblers, the MRI showed their basal ganglia lighting up with the exact same intensity as if they had just won the jackpot.
Their brains are chemically incapable of distinguishing between almost winning and actually winning.
Because the slot machine is literally engineered to exploit that. It manufactures a high frequency of near misses to trigger that dopamine anticipation loop without paying out a dime.
It's a closed loop of synthetic reinforcement. But knowing our neurochemistry can be hacked like this brings up a huge contradiction in the text regarding ethics and personal responsibility.
Yeah, the tension between neurological determinism and the law. Like Brian Thomas, the guy who strangled his wife during a sleep terror.
Right. Sleep terrors originate in the brainstem and basal ganglia, while the prefrontal cortex, the conscious part, is entirely paralyzed.
He was executing an automated defensive macro against a perceived intruder with zero conscious agency. And he was acquitted of murder.
Because the jury recognized it was an automated biological script. But then the text brings up Angie Bachman, who racked up $125,000 in casino debt in one day.
Right. Haraz sued her, and she countersued. Her defense was basically the Reza Habib MRI study. She was a pathological gambler, her basal ganglia was hijacked by near-miss algorithms, and the casino targeted her with specific cues.
They gave her free suites and VIP hosts exactly when she was most vulnerable. She argued she had no conscious control to stop pulling the lever, just like Brian Thomas.
But she wasn't acquitted. She was held fully liable. The text shows empirical data that cravings operate below conscious control, but society says she's responsible and he isn't.
The author reconciles it through the concept of awareness. Brian Thomas had no idea he had a sleep-strangling macro. You can't preempt a script you don't know
But
exists.
Bugman knew she was a pathological gambler.
Exactly. The text argues that awareness transfers the ethical burden back to the individual, even if the execution of the habit is automatic.
It's a brutal standard. It basically says, yeah, a billion-dollar company weaponized your neurochemistry, but because you know it, you have to override it.
And overriding it requires willpower, which is where the traditional self-help advice of just try harder completely falls apart.
Right, because willpower isn't a static character trait. It's a finite, heavily fatigable muscle.
The clinical term is ego depletion. When you wake up, your prefrontal cortex has a full reserve of regulatory energy, but every act of self-restraint drains it.
And it's the little things, biting your tongue when your boss says something annoying, or staring at a boring spreadsheet instead of checking your phone.
Each of those microfrictions requires the prefrontal cortex to suppress a basal ganglia impulse. By 8:00 p.m., you're in total ego depletion.
So when a high-stress inflection point hits, like an argument with your spouse, your brain just doesn't have the fuel to intervene.
And the basal ganglia, which needs almost zero energy to run its compiled macros, meets no resistance and just initiates the old destructive loop.
Which is why relying on willpower in the moment of temptation is biologically doomed. You're asking a fatigued muscle to max out during a crisis.
To survive those moments, you have to bypass willpower entirely, which we'll get into with the implementation intentions.
Yeah, we'll get to the 90-day blueprint shortly, but first we have to scale this up. From the micro to the macro. If an individual brain relies on chunks, how does an organization with 50,000 people not just collapse?
They rely on the exact same loop, but in organizational behavior, they call the automated scripts routines, and the social contracts governing them are called truces.
Truces, like a state of suspended hostility.
That's exactly what most corporate environments are. Competing ambitions, rivalries, finite budgets. If they had to actively negotiate every decision daily, the company would be paralyzed.
So they form these unspoken truces to keep the peace. Who makes what call? Whose turf is whose?
Right, but those toxic truces create terrifying blind spots. The text highlights the King's Cross underground fire in London. 31 people died because of lethal adherence to truces.
It's unbelievable. A ticketing agent literally saw a burning tissue. But the unspoken truce was that ticketing agents don't leave their posts for fire hazards. That was the maintenance department's job.
And the safety inspectors who eventually saw the smoke had a rigid routine that forbade them from calling the fire brigade without the station manager's authorization.
And the manager's routine was to prevent panic, so they didn't stop the trains. Everyone was executing their localized script flawlessly. Stay in your lane.
But because the truces blocked cross-departmental communication, nobody saw the macro reality that the station was becoming an inferno.
It's the basal ganglia on a corporate scale, a compiled macro executing blindly in a lethal environment. So how do you dismantle a toxic truce like that?
You have to engineer a shock to the system using a keystone habit.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at Paul O'Neill at Alcoa. He takes over this massive, chaotic, inefficient aluminum company.
Wall Street expects him to aggressively restructure finance, but instead, he ignores profit margins entirely.
He leverages a crisis worker injuries to change one single keystone habit. 0 injuries.
A keystone habit is basically an organizational pivot point. Once it's established, it acts as a solvent that breaks down toxic truces and triggers a chain reaction everywhere else.
For Alcoa, the mechanism was the 24-hour safety reporting rule. And I want to trace the exact connective tissue here, because saying safety improved profit sounds like magic, but the mechanics are brilliant.
O'Neill mandated that if anyone got hurt, the unit president had to put a prevention plan on O'Neill's desk within 24 hours or lose their promotion eligibility.
Think about the infrastructure required to do that. A guy burns his hand on the floor. Normally, the fifth manager hides it to protect their record.
But under the new rule, the worker has to halt production and tell the manager. The manager has to bypass the regional directors and call the VP.
And the VP has to immediately interface with the CEO. O'Neill literally weaponized their urge for career advancement to shatter the communication silos.
Exactly. He forced them to build a high-speed communication infrastructure, and once that became habitual, they used that exact same pipeline to transmit efficiency innovations.
So a worker who finds a faster way to cast aluminum suddenly has a direct line to upper management. And that one keystone habit increased market cap by $27 billion. dollars.
It's a masterclass in systemic change. But the text presents a really interesting contradiction when we look at Starbucks attempting to engineer employee willpower.
Yeah, the latte method.
Right. A latte stands for listen, acknowledge, take action, thank, explain. It's a highly prescriptive script for baristas dealing with angry customers.
The book frames latte as this gold standard for institutionalizing willpower. The barista doesn't need to use their depleted prefrontal cortex. They just run the latte macro.
But if you read the footnotes, a Starbucks spokesperson explicitly admits they are moving away from rigid scripts like latte in favor of employee empowerment.
Wait, if it's the holy grail, why are they dismantling it?
Because prescriptive routines are just neurological training wheels. For a new hire, a rigid macro is necessary to prevent an emotional breakdown.
But as they achieve mastery, the script becomes a straitjacket. You can't show genuine empathy if you're executing a robotic acronym. The organization outgrew the truce.
Which is a perfect segue into the dark arts of this whole thing. Because if a company can engineer routines for its employees, they are using way more sophisticated models on you, the consumer.
Data-driven habit marketing. It's terrifying. Retailers know brand loyalty is a deeply chunked macro. We buy the same detergent forever.
But data scientists found a window where the basal ganglia's hold shatters major life events. And the most lucrative one is a new baby.
New parents are sleep-deprived, stressed, their routines are destroyed, their cognitive load is maxed out, making them highly vulnerable to forming new, unified shopping habits.
So if Target can get you during that brief window, you'll buy all your groceries and electronics there for the next decade.
Enter Andrew Pohl, the statistician at Target. His directive was to identify pregnant customers before they even told anyone they were pregnant.
Target uses a unique guest ID to aggregate every single credit card swipe, search, and coupon into a massive predictive profile.
And Pohl built this predictive pregnancy model. He didn't just look for cribs. He looked at subtle deviations across 25 specific products.
Like women in their second trimester suddenly buying large quantities of unscented lotion.
Unscented lotion. And then weeks later, magnesium supplements and specific cotton balls.
By feeding those microscopic data points into the algorithm, Poll could assign a pregnancy probability score and predict the due date within a tiny window.
So Target could mail coupons for diapers right when the consumer's habits were most brittle. But that creates a massive psychological problem, the creep factor.
Right. If a pregnant woman hasn't told anyone and she gets a catalog entirely full of maternity gear, her prefrontal cortex instantly recognizes the surveillance.
The threat detection systems flare up and she rejects the brand. So how do they bypass the creep factor?
They use the familiarity principle. The text calls it dressing the new in old clothes. You have to camouflage the algorithmic prediction to soothe the basal ganglia.
Target's solution was just diabolical. They dynamically generated catalogs that sandwiched the invasive baby coupons between random, familiar stuff.
A diaper discount next to an ad for wine glasses. A prenatal vitamin coupon next to a lawnmower.
It made it look entirely coincidental. The brain registers the familiar lawnmower, the threat detection stands down, and the basal ganglia accepts the new cue blindly.
And that exact same psychological exploit is used in the music industry. The text talks about polyphonic HMI and their hit song science algorithm.
Right? They mapped the mathematical markers of every successful pop song, and when Outkast dropped Hey Ya, the algorithm predicted it would be a historic smash hit.
But when radio stations played it, listener data plummeted. People hated it and changed the station immediately.
Because it sounded completely different from the dominant R&B at the time, the basal ganglia thrives on familiar chunks, and Hey Ya was too novel.
The cognitive load was too high, so the brain rejected it. To fix it, radio DJs had to hack the familiarity principle using sandwiching.
They would play a massive hit, like Celine Dion, then immediately play Hey Ya, and transition into another familiar track like Matchbox 20.
They wrapped the unfamiliar sounds of Outkast in the comfortable auditory clothing of proven hits. The basal ganglia was pacified, and it became the biggest song in the world.
Whether it's a baby coupon or an avant-garde pop track, the mechanics are the same. You bypass conscious resistance by saturating the environment with trusted cues.
Which finally brings us to the 90-day blueprint, the complete guide to 100 out of 100 mastery. How do you actually reclaim your agency from this machinery?
Right, we've mapped the neurology, the truces, the manipulation. Now let's build the framework.
First, we have to distinguish between clinical habit reversal training and the golden rule. Clinical training is mostly for physical tics, like nail biting. It uses a competing response.
A blunt force interruption, like clasping your hands when you feel a tick. But for deep emotional habits like doom scrolling, we need the golden rule.
And the foundational premise of the golden rule is intimidating. You can never actually delete a neural pathway. Once a macro is compiled, it's permanent.
You can't extinguish it. To achieve mastery, you have to hijack the existing loop. You keep the old cue, you keep the old reward, but you forcefully insert a new routine in the middle.
Exactly. So week one of the blueprint is the diagnostic phase. You have to map the hidden topography of your own loop. Step one, isolate the routine.
You can't just say, I want to be more productive. That's useless. You have to identify the physical action. At 2:00 p.m., I read political news for 40 minutes.
Once you have the routine, step two is experiment with rewards. Treat yourself like a blind test subject because you don't actually know what your basal ganglia is craving.
If you have an afternoon cookie habit, you might think it's low blood sugar, but maybe you're just craving a distraction from a spreadsheet or social interaction.
To find out, test competing hypotheses. Day one, eat an apple instead. Day two, go for a walk. Day three, chat with a coworker without eating anything.
And this leads to step 3, the 3-word awareness test. This is crucial. When you get back to your desk, immediately write down 3 words, any 3 words.
Tired, frustrated, blue. The words don't matter. The physical act of writing is the mechanism. It forces blood flow and electrical activity back into your prefrontal cortex.
It wakes you up from the automated state. Then you set an alarm for 15 minutes. If the craving for the cookie is gone, you've successfully identified the true reward.
But you still need to find the trigger. So step 4 is the 5-category diagnostic. To filter out the terabytes of sensory data, you map the 5 categories for every urge.
Location, time, emotional state, other people, and the immediately preceding action. You log that for 5 days, and the hidden algorithm reveals itself.
It's exactly 2:30 p.m. I just finished a Zoom call and I feel anxious. You've mapped the entire loop, which initiates week 2, the implementation phase.
Knowing the map isn't enough, because ego depletion guarantees your willpower will fail at 2:30 p.m.
Right. You must bypass willpower using implementation intentions. You literally write down a conditional formula to pre-compile a new macro for the basal ganglia.
When I see CUE, I will do new routine in order to get reward.
So when 2:30 p.m. hits and the meeting ends, I will immediately do a 10-minute stretching protocol in the break room.
By preloading that script, the basal ganglia defaults to the new blueprint instead of the destructive loop when your battery is dead.
But we have to address a massive contradiction here regarding the speed of all this. The text opens with Lisa Allen, who quits smoking, starts running marathons, and buys a house almost overnight.
It reads like this magical cinematic metamorphosis. But the clinical appendix at the back of the book explicitly warns that habit change is a grueling, miserable process that never really concludes.
The narrative implies a rapid shift, but the neurological reality in the appendix confirms that the basal ganglia is highly resistant to rewiring. You will experience repeated relapses.
Which transitions perfectly into month 1 to month 3, infrastructure and integration. Because an implementation intention will shatter during a crisis without the neuroscience of belief.
The text cites Alcoholics Anonymous and Saddleback Church. You cannot manufacture belief in isolation. Your prefrontal cortex will succumb to doubt.
You have to integrate into a community of people who have successfully executed the exact same rewrite. Witnessing their success provides the social proof to suspend disbelief.
Community is the scaffolding. And in month 3, you run the 5 whys audit, because you will fail. And when you do, you don't use guilt, you use root cause analysis.
Why did I doom scroll? Because I was anxious. Why was I anxious? Because the KPI was vague. Why was it vague? Because I didn't ask my manager. You drill down to the foundational bug in the code.
You iteratively patch the script. And the ultimate goal of this 90-day cycle is the final phase, permanent identity ownership.
The linguistic framing completely changes. It's no longer, I am trying to stop snacking. It's, I am a person who tracks my macros.
It ceases to be an external routine. The basal ganglia is no longer running a patched script. It is operating the core OS of who you are.
Complete synthesis of conscious intention and automated execution. 100 out of 100 mastery.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the end of this deep dive, and I want to leave you with a chilling reality to mull over today. If 40% of every physical movement and purchase you make is executed by primitive cells in the dark,
And if massive corporations are using predictive data to seamlessly inject algorithms into your basal ganglia using the familiarity principle.
you have to ask yourself a terrifying question.
Yeah.
When you navigate your day, what you buy, the media you consume, how you vote, how much of that is your deliberate, conscious agency?
And how much is just a beautifully camouflaged macro written by someone else?
The architecture is there. The only question is who is programming it. So here's a challenge to push you beyond average. Don't remain passive. Tomorrow morning, isolate your most stubborn habit. Apply the 5-category diagnostic. Uncover your cue and physically write your implementation intention before your prefrontal cortex burns out. Take the terminal back from your basal ganglia and write the code yourself.